This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's Thanksgiving, or will be soon. And we have lots to be thankful for. This was an interesting week. I was thinking about the University of Illinois and how it has helped in many, many situations, but including my own. I often get asked how I got into this game and what I do, and it's hard to put it together in some sort of sensible fashion. But I go back to Cyril Hopkins. Cyril Hopkins' Cafe Mighty Good. He was a soil scientist. He approached the agricultural people at the federal level and about mapping. One of the things we do as we get more sophisticated is to document the things that we're dealing with. You have, by the seat of your pants, an idea that this soil is sandy and this soil is clay. But Cyril Hopkins wanted to put some more measures to that. And eventually, the University of Illinois accepted him as a agronomist and as a map maker. That meant that he took the soils that we have and he would put them through a sieve and notice the amount of material that was, oh, you moved it. So he began to document things in a more detailed fashion, so you knew what was organic matter, what was its ion exchange capacity for holding nutriments. It was giving a formal place for a katina, which was, if you go to a slope, the soils at the top, xenia or something like that, are dryish, and down the slope you get to Drummer and Flanagan, which are heavy soils that are with a lot of moisture, a lot of organic matter, and that sequence was there. So just for the University of Illinois to accept that Cyril Hopkins' Cafe Mighty Good could come here and have a laboratory, and his name represents all the elements that he was looking at in the soil. And Cafe Mighty Good was calcium and iron and magnesium, and so his acronym was there. Along the same lines, we had a seminar in Natural History Survey by a guy named Nicholas Barber, and he was looking at the organisms in managed, mainly prairies, managed and planted prairies, and noticing the change. He was working a lot with Natusa grasslands, where buffaloes have been included, and that was interesting because there are many, many variables, and how do you put these variables together? Well, one of the things that computerization has done is allow us to look at more variables, whether they be bacteria or fungi or vegetable crops or organic matter. And a lot of this has to do with human intervention, human involvement. For instance, we do have autumn olives that have been brought in genuinely to provide for wildlife, but then they have become a weed. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with Canada thistle that comes to head early in the season when there's no mowing, but by the time mowing starts, it's gone to seed and can be spread around the adjacent farmlands. So I'll come back to Nicholas at a later date, but I am watching some of these very interesting things where you take just a spoonful of soil and notice the dynamics of what is happening there. We also look at history, and at the moment I'm a little concerned about a house on High Cross Road, which is a house that was built largely from materials from the Big Grove. And when we put in a trail, we hope that there will be areas 5 and 10 miles on either side of that trail that are interesting. And if you go up 150, you come to the end of the trail and stop there by Walmart, you can go north, and there is this house, which has largely got beams that are walnut from the Big Grove. And then you go a little further and you get tiny greens and a bunch of ecological people doing things there. Then you get to brownfield woods, and then again to early settlement of Urbana, and it was in the woods mainly because of the protection provided by the woods and the lack of wind and the lack of fire to some extent, although it's been realized that forests too burn and should be burned to keep them viable. Part of the problem with an old house is that it's not accessible by ADA standards, but historic buildings don't always conform to national norms. I think of Tim Nugent saying that when he created laws that would help disabled people, then the second level people took over and made this a rule which was more stringent than he had ever thought of. You don't really need to put a ramp to the 8th floor of a building, as the people who are in wheelchairs have an understanding of there are limits. So if you have an old building, you have to think about its accessibility, but you also have to think about its repair. We over and over have experienced people who have saved old buildings, but the cost is high, and then they can't be occupied easily, and if they are occupied, they're expensive. So I'm watching the Binkhead House, which is on the corner of Perkins and High Cross Road. It's got a lot of vegetation around it, and so that is being utilized for native plantings. And how do you do that? And then again, we're not sure of all those things. The most interesting thing this week has been Plato, and the fact that Brian Deers has written a book after about 30 years of study and research about Plato. He figures that the work that went on with Plato has been at a national level. Some of the thinking has emanated from the two oceans, the East Coast and the West Coast. But this was happening in East Central Illinois, in the Midwest. And that was a little different to start with. You don't have quite the environment that you have in the two coasts. Before I came here, I had been at the University of Sydney, and the University of Sydney was proud to have a Celiac computer. Celiac was the Sydney edition of ILIAC. And ILIAC was an early computer with a huge mainframe, perhaps half the size of a house, and it was used for many years using vacuum tubes, and it was early programming, and it attempted to basically look at the database and look for variables and look for it could repeat things, but this was a simple device, and later was replaced by chips invented by people like Bardeen. So when I came here, I was interested to find that there was an ILIAC, and that was the progenitor to what was at University of Sydney. The Sydney edition was run by a young Canadian fellow. He was in physics, and he was outspoken. He had a beard in an era when there weren't very many beards. And it was interesting that he was in the physics department rather than, say, electrical engineering. His name was Harry Messel, and he was famous at the time for what he was doing. When I came here, I had been teaching at a second-level college where a lot of the teaching was done by rote, because you can't have the experimental opportunity that you have at a major university. So you try to augment teaching with units that would be helpful to provide independent study. So I wanted to combine art and education and apply it to science. I worked with, was lucky enough to get an assistantship with agriculture, and worked with agricultural visual services and Hadley Reed and that service, which comes across on WILL at 2 o'clock each day and runs conferences around the state. And then I was at the same time studying art and education and science, as I had wanted to do, it wasn't a very acceptable thing to do because it was felt that you should be doing more monolithic things and specializing. That has changed considerably over the last few years, and now there's a big drive to have people together in groups that come with different ideas and battle out with each other and do interesting things. I morphed into a school science curriculum project which developed small programs in physics, chemistry, biology to allow us to give a teacher a unit. It might be like running water and river development, or something where it could be infused into an existing program and an existing curriculum without invading, or I was going to say dumping on the teacher that's involved. The teacher is supreme, and the feeling was that these units should be helpful but not impose, and not be like there was a visiting expert that overrode the teacher. But in this whole process, I had a lot of support from different people, and so as Thanksgiving comes by, I wish to think about how this came up together. Early on, a guy named Skinner, working out of Harvard, was watching his good teacher working with students, and some students would finish a problem early and some would finish it late, and if you had 30 students, that didn't seem to excite Skinner. So he started to think about what it is that you could do to add units of interest to a curriculum, so that you could have somebody finish a problem and then go on to the next problem and then the next problem. It was very linear, and not everyone is linear. And that's the advantage of computers these days. It will allow you to go off in different directions. But there was a desire to have the opportunity to continue and to have instant gratification, to finish your math program and get an answer and find that it is right, is stimulating. That's better than the teacher taking the program home or the paper home and having to check it out 24 hours later or even further than that. How could you do that? So Skinner started to experiment with rats and watch what they would do. How could you encourage their involvement? Could you have a lever they would push and get fed Pavlov style? And then you could test their minds so that they would have to find the lever somewhere else. So Skinner married, and the couple decided to experiment with their students, their children. And so they created a Skinner box which had controlled temperature and the child was allowed to move and think and do independently. And the feeling was that sometimes the environment around you or the environment that you actually create can be very useful in your education. And so that led to teaching machines that would allow you to not only be linear, but perhaps to be a little bit more complex and move off into conceptual territories that would need branching. There was this movement moved around and was handled by IBM and other organizations. It was not awfully popular and had a lot of criticism, but it had an interesting base in the University of Illinois with a leader known as Stollerow. And Stollerow and Anderson had teaching program interests, and that developed and evolved. Then there were things that were happening at the world level. There'd been the World War II situation and the Japanese invasion of Hawaii. There had been in 1957 Sputnik, and there the U.S. was realizing that there was a satellite running around the world that could indeed carry weapons, and all of a sudden science education blossomed. The university had leadership from people in the administration. They got together, Brown in physics and Everett in engineering, and Stollerow in the educational psychology side of things. And they tried to figure out what they could do to have to use early computers like ELIAC to put together an interactive type of teaching machine. And so they were looking for people. They brought in a person named Alpert, and Alpert was assigned to a unit that was a militaristic unit. It was CSL, and he renamed it to Coordinated Science Lab, and it was basically taking a group of people from the physics department to think about this topic. They found it hard to find a leadership because no one was quite sure of what they could do, whether it was in electrical engineering or education or in physics. And it grew a lab which was called the CSL, and it was very near to University High School, where there was a curriculum lab, and people like Biberman and Golden and others were brought in to aid and abet this sort of thinking. They eventually found a very interesting fellow who just got his PhD. He came from a family in Collinville, Illinois, so he was expected by the family to go back and sell Ford cars. But he was interested in innovation, and he was tapped to be a leader of this organization, which would become Plato. So Brian here has written a book. It's taken him about 30 years, and I'll read the cover flap detail because it summarizes some of the things that happened. At the time when Steve Jobs was only a teenager and Mark Zuckerberg wasn't even born, a group of visionary engineers and designers, some of them only high school students, in the late 1960s and 70s created a computer system called Plato, which was light years ahead in experimenting with how people would learn, engage, communicate, and play through connected computers. Not only did Plato engineers make significant hardware breakthroughs with plasma displays and touch screens, but Plato programmers also came up with a long list of software innovations: chat rooms, instant messaging, message boards, screensavers, multiple player games, online newspapers, interactive fiction, and also emotions. How could you express that? They were among the first to identify and also to realize the potential and scope of social interconnectivity of computers. Well before the creation of the internet, Plato was the foundational model for every online community that to follow in its footsteps. The friendly orange glow came from computers where that glow was enough to light the room, so you didn't have to have overhead lighting on. You saw your screen better. So the book is titled The Friendly Orange Glow. It is the first history to recount in fascinating detail the remarkable accomplishments and inspiring personal stories of the Plato community. The addictive nature of Plato ruined many college careers. People got active, and that was what they did. It also launched path-breaking, multi-million-dollar software products. Its development, impact, and eventual disappearance provide an instructive case study of technological innovation and disruption, project management, and missed opportunities. Above all, the friendly orange glow at last reveals new perspectives on the origin of social computing and our internet infatuated world. So, Brian Deere was here to give a talk at Campbell Hall, and he ran through some of this development, and was the meeting was attended by a large representative, I'm sure, of people who have helped with the establishment of Plato. I was at a Plato conference some time ago, and somebody asked if people would put their hands up if they climbed the tower. There was, in the CSL building, a radar tower. Some of these people were into radar during World War II, including Albert. And this was a convenient way for high school students that could not be paid, could not be legal, to enter the Plato domain. The building was a strange-looking building. It had 4 stories, was built on additions, and it had been the university's power plant, which had been moved further away, and this was adaptive reuse of the buildings. And the laboratories were on the upper floors, and the students would find themselves a way to be there, and they were excited to do these things. So were the adult students. We had one ourselves here with WEFT, which was Reynolds, and Reynolds was almost to his PhD through, and he took off and did a lot with chat rooms and some of these early things with Plato. He also was one of the founders for the Grateful Dead at WEFT, and ran it for many years. So he was just one of those people who, in those days, was referred to as geeks or people who did things differently and didn't necessarily follow through their curriculum to degrees, and yet in the long run became often well-paid people doing interesting things. And so when they asked for how many people, about 75 people put up their hands to say that they had climbed the radar tower to get into the computer. Some would hide behind their areas and come out once their buildings were closed. But these were the innovators, which often innovated to the extent that they were hacking or doing things that were innovative and interesting at testing the metal of the machinery and extending it. I can remember walking into one of these labs, and at that stage, some of the visual material was in a carousel, so you had to get to your computer, and then you had to turn on the carousel to get a graph or a chart. And gradually that got to be a touch screen and plasma displays, which have their other technological advantages that went elsewhere. So his story is a story of innovators, mavericks, hackers, geniuses, visionaries, scientists, and educators all came together, and they had this Plato system spread around the university. There was a huge lab in modern languages, and some of the people who kept these things going were high school students, and one of them was Jim Payne, who eventually was the backup person in the modern language lab and elsewhere too, I think. The family was at the meeting, and his brother Tom, who has been a pilot, has married Chris, and I think they met at University High School. This was another institution that had its moments. It could be very laissez-faire, and that could be interesting. We had the institution of the curriculum lab lost all its Watts lines at one stage, and there was Ma Bell working at it for 3 days and couldn't figure out what was going on. And then somebody said, that little kid that's out there, he does interesting things, and he goes into the second building, and there's some leftover iliac parts there, and why don't you ask him? And he showed them what he was doing and pulled a few plugs, and they all had their Watts lines back. So the student population at University High School was interesting, and at one stage the university was thinking of closing it. It was they were putting in a Granger library, and they needed parking. They were getting rid of the botany annex across the road, and a Greek Revival Cottage was there, and it was going to. So, and Goldwasser had a lot to do with trying to keep that going. Again, a physicist with vice-chancellorial power and a lot of people behind him. So University High School is still there and doing interesting things. I had the advantage of, I was not a computer geek. I could use computers, but I was not associated with Plato. But the same curriculum development people who were working together, the same energy spilled over into what I was trying to do with natural areas. Dr. Bieberman, who was pulled in to be part of these coordinated science lab activities, Bill Golden, his assistant, Rachel Dial was brought in to be a librarian to his associate there. These were innovative people, not only doing it in the University of Illinois. Max Bieberman was working in England and actually passed away on his way back from England. But these people allowed us to work generally, and so we established natural areas instructional development, which provided services to many departments. It might range from a slide of support to being invited to be a devil's advocate, to ask questions that might not be asked by students, to providing a display, to working with the community. And so as the Plato people suggested, we worked with a lot of different departments, got support from those departments. With botany, we suggested that the multiple choice exams could be recorded for their accuracy. Did certain questions work well? Did they? Was it more accurate to have 14 graduate students grading the program, the 600 students in a hurry before they went home? Was it more accurate to have a mechanical record of the results? And could there be some written material that would have to be read? But how do you balance this out? And the Office of Instructional Resources was willing and helpful. Zoology, landscape architecture, planning, education. The Committee on Natural Areas out of the Graduate College employed me to work with natural areas throughout the state. And that gave me a base for working with Curriculum Lab, with environmental studies, which at that time there was a drive to do something about environmental studies. And this sort of energy and enthusiasm and interest was university-wide and tremendously supportive. So on Thanksgiving Day, I give thanks for that sort of involvement. I was kind of a neophyte. I didn't have the maths and chemistry to compete with specialists. I didn't have the art. I had the feeling for it, but I hadn't had the specialty there. And the same with education. I wasn't an expert in Dewey education or whatever. And so I was a generalist and interested in all sorts of things, which was sort of part of the spirit and philosophy here. They had some rules that they wanted out of the likes of a program, and I put these down somewhere. Let me see where I put them. They wanted people to be involved. They wanted the handling of a database was okay, but they wanted people to be involved, and thus the University High School. They realized that the computer language was a new language, so they'd have to train people how to recognize some of the idioms that are a computer language. You had to, the early stages, you had to have cards with, you had to have spreadsheets with 80 spots, and then you can convert them to cards with a little hole in them where a vacuum would register a computer rheostat, and there was a need for some teaching objectives. This wasn't just going to be totally laissez-faire. You had to have some objectives, and you had to make sure that the students were going to get something finite out of this. There had to be some research. There had to be people like Jack Easley and others. Bob Stake started to look at conceptual things. When does a child learn to catch a ball? When does a child learn to be able to break a stick of chalk? So what's the time frame here? What is going on in a learner's mind? And also this had to apply to other places, other institutions, and eventually it did lean to the establishment of Mosaic and Netscape and programs that were fundamental to moving on. They had to have some sort of diagram as to how this might function, how you would include the computer, how you would include other people on different computers, how would you store information, and how would you encourage people to, and thousands of them, to think about the whole process. So over the years, we got to be independent of the monolithic study, but more a lower key service facility. And then the financial crunch came, so we no longer could charge departments for our services from contingency accounts. And we had been working a lot with community people, so we went community. And we looked around, and Champaign at that time was escaping to the malls. The malls were big, and so Champaign was left somewhat without the Pennies and the Sears and the other big organizations. And so Market Street, including where Weft is, was a central business district. And we felt that we could get reasonable rent there, and but we could also perhaps contribute to the demise of the city at that time. Not sure how much we influenced that, but we put in a little pocket Prairie across the way, and we had a gallery on Walnut Street, and you could walk through the gallery, through ERES, through to the pocket Prairie, and that has educated many, many people. And even just yesterday I was wandering around, and somebody had gotten excited by just what we leave in the front porch for people to see, to think about, and stimulate interest and enthusiasm. So your downtown district becomes a little bit like Plato, a family of men, or man and woman. And how do we encourage that? The area has been alive with bars. It's been coming back. It's called gentrification, and the so eventually we may have to leave if the tax base goes up so high that we can't do it anymore. But the people in downtown need to have a real life too. So a big dig with a little prairie here and there and water impounded so that it can go out slowly and not have you rowing boats in Green Street. These things have, progress has occurred. We still have lots to do. We've walked into the North End, where is basically a black community. It's been somewhat replaced by big digs and out movement, and whereas everyone would teach their neighbors' children or act again like a family, it's gotten broken up a little bit, but it's still there. And so some of our initial excitement comes from the computer era and the ability to work on the side of people who do exciting things, and we hope some of those exciting things eventuate for ourselves. One of the things we have done is to morph from the natural areas instructional development to educational resources in environmental science, which is more broad, and to establish an agency that has run for 35 years. We were interested in a docent group that would go to natural areas and find out about them, and then teach about them to others, whether that be adults or park districts or school people. We've got together with students, whether they be I help with 50 students at once, and picking seed or high school students sorting seed. And now that some of those students are doing their own thing. And one of the questions that came from the crowd at the Campbell meeting was, do you have a history of what happened to these people? And some of them would lose out because they just didn't happen to be in the right place at the right time, but many of them have gone on to major jobs that, and it's been interesting that I've known people who have been professors and then had children who did not get degrees but were getting salaries that were higher than their own professorial salary. So the process goes on, and it goes on with people like Ravi Iyer, who has been Vice Chancellor for research and then retired back to the CSL, and to work with Searle, computer educational research, but also there's another Searle that is Army-based. And at one stage down the street there was an Army unit, advanced computation, and then in the Vietnam era there was a resistance to the research that was going on, the mapping that was going on, the computerization. They had a building with the central core was computers, and the people were all outside. Then at one stage, I look out the window from the space provided by the curriculum lab, and there's every 2 feet was a Army person with a bayonet. So these innovations don't go easily, and these sorts of questions. So the Army Corps of Engineers was moved out to Searle in the research area in West Champaign, and that solved some of the problems, but the innovators are still working with the university, and many people have received a start at the biology division there or the mechanical engineering division there, and received their assistantships from there. But it's just out of that mainstream university situation. It continues, and we are very pleased to have that sort of involvement. I've got a few minutes here, and I started off by saying that Cyril Hopkins, another innovator, came to do soil mapping, and that has made the rich soils of Illinois even richer. And there are people, a number of people who are looking at variables. The gene pool has come to the fore, RNA and DNA, and the breeding of plants resistant to herbicides, the resistance of plants. There's a lot of research going on, and I mentioned Nicholas Barker, who was speaking at the Natural History Survey building on Tuesday, and he's working at Northern Illinois University and doing biological research and comparing organized agriculture and looking at various associations. And he's been working at Natucha in northern Illinois a lot, and this has great variation, and he's been working with other people and looking at different biota. He's looking at the bacteria and the fungi in the soil and noticing their change. Many of us know that there are changes going on by the seat of our pants. You'll know that yellow coneflower is often strong in the 4th year of growth of regenerated prairie. You'll notice how New England aster works. You know a little bit, but it's very helpful to get some statistic on exactly what is happening and how we might adapt. So he's been looking at entomology, insects, and what they do, and who eats who, and how we can document that and perhaps adapt our human movements to knowing that information. This involves statistics. Statistics started with agronomy and moved into places like education. Is prime in biological research, but it's not an easy science. It involves mathematics, and we encourage those people who specialize in that domain and take things one step further. We now have a huge computer on St. Mary's Road that can do some of these things and do it quickly and repetitively. And we have the next program here is the Music of Indian, and we have a professor of redundancy here, so that you can do something and something and something else, and it's just wonderful to have that sort of infusion. That's all I can say today. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and remember the innovatives that do these interesting things. And this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And we do say that there's a disclaimer to say that this is our thought and not the thought of prairie air, but you get the message. Thank you.